The photograph had been stored in a manila envelope for decades, forgotten among the personal effects donated to the Texas State Historical Museum. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a specialist in Civil War and frontier photography, carefully removed the aged image from its protective sleeve. Her trained eyes immediately, drawn to its exceptional clarity and composition, the sepia-toned portrait showed a young cowboy, perhaps in his mid-20s, sitting calmly on the steps of what appeared to be a frontier courthouse. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, with one arm resting on his knee and his hat tilted at a confident angle. He wore the typical attire of a Texas cattleman from the 1870s: dark trousers, a simple cotton shirt, leather vest, and well-worn boots that spoke of countless hours in the saddle. What struck Elena most was the man's expression. Unlike many frontier photographs, where subjects appeared stiff and uncomfortable due to long exposure times, this cowboy seemed completely at ease. His eyes held a calm, almost serene quality, and there was the hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He looked like a man without a care in the world. On the back of the photograph, written in faded ink, was a simple inscription: Thomas, Abilene, Kansas, July 1875. Below that, in different handwriting, someone had added, "May God forgive him." Elena frowned at the cryptic message. The photograph itself seemed innocent enough, just another young man making his way in the post-Civil War frontier. But something about the second inscription suggested there was more to Thomas's story than appeared on the surface. She placed the photograph under her desk lamp and reached for her magnifying glass, beginning the careful examination that had become second nature in her work. As Elena adjusted her magnifying glass over the photograph, she systematically examined every detail, from the weathered wood of the courthouse steps to the texture of Thomas's clothing. Her attention was drawn to his gun belt, where a single revolver hung in a well-worn leather holster. The weapon appeared to be a Colt single-action Army revolver, commonly known as the Peacemaker, which had become standard among lawmen and gunfighters of the era. But as she focused more closely on the revolver's grip, Elena's breath caught. There, carved into the ivory handle with meticulous precision, was a series of tiny symbols that definitely didn't belong to standard gunsmith work. At first glance, they appeared to be decorative engravings, but closer examination revealed something far more disturbing. The symbols were small human figures, stick-like representations carved in a row along the gun's grip. Elena counted them carefully, 17 tiny figures, each no larger than a grain of rice, but carved with deliberate precision. Each figure appeared to have a small line drawn across its neck, like a cut or slash mark. Elena leaned back in her chair, her heart racing. In her years of studying frontier artifacts, she had encountered similar markings before, though never so elaborately displayed. Some gunfighters and outlaws of the period had been known to carve notches or symbols into their weapons to represent their kills. But this was different. These weren't simple notches, they were detailed representations of human forms, each one marked with what appeared to be the method of death. The calm, serene expression on Thomas's face in the photograph suddenly took on a more sinister quality. If her suspicions were correct, she was looking at evidence of a mass murderer who had been confident enough to pose for a formal portrait with his weapon and his tally of victims clearly visible for anyone who cared to look closely enough. Elena immediately began researching historical records from Abilene, Kansas in 1875. The cattle town had been one of the most notorious settlements in the post-Civil War frontier, a place where Texas cowboys drove their herds north and where violence was an everyday occurrence. Abilene had seen its share of gunfighters, outlaws, and men who lived by the gun. She started with newspaper archives from the Abilene Chronicle, searching for any mention of a man named Thomas. During the summer of 1875, what she found painted a picture of a town struggling with lawlessness and violence. The newspaper was filled with reports of shootings, robberies, and mysterious disappearances that plagued the community throughout that year. One article from July 15, 1875, caught her attention. Local businessman Thomas Hartwell continues to provide security services for cattle drives passing through our fair town. Mr. Hartwell's reputation for maintaining order has made him much sought after by trail bosses seeking safe passage through our territory. Elena found several more references to Thomas Hartwell in the following weeks. He appeared to be a respected member of the community, someone who hired his gun to protect cattle drives from rustlers and bandits. Trail bosses consistently praised his effectiveness, noting that cattle drives under Hartwell's protection rarely suffered losses from criminal activity. But as Elena dug deeper, she began to find disturbing patterns in the newspaper reports. While Hartwell's protected cattle drives remained safe, there were consistent reports of dead bodies found along the trails after his groups had passed through. The deaths were typically attributed to conflicts with outlaws or natural causes, but the frequency was unusual. Most disturbing was a report from August 3, 1875. The body of suspected cattle rustler Miguel Santos was discovered 3 miles south of town, apparently shot while attempting to flee pursuing lawmen. Local security contractor Thomas Hartwell reported the incident to authorities. Elena's research revealed a troubling pattern that extended far beyond Abilene. As she traced Thomas Hartwell's movements through various frontier towns between 1873 and 1875, she discovered that wherever he went, unexplained deaths followed. Hartwell had worked as a hired gun security contractor and occasional deputy sheriff throughout Kansas, Texas, and Colorado Territory. In each location, local newspapers praised Hartwell's effectiveness in dealing with criminal elements. Cattle rustlers, horse thieves, and outlaws seemed to disappear or turn up dead whenever Hartwell was operating in the area. On the surface, it appeared he was simply good at his job protecting honest citizens and eliminating threats to law and order. But Elena noticed something disturbing in the details. Many of the dead men were found alone, shot from a distance with no witnesses to the confrontations. Hartwell consistently claimed self-defense or justifiable homicide in service of protecting his clients, and local authorities rarely questioned his accounts. In the chaotic frontier environment, one less outlaw was generally seen as a positive development. A particularly revealing article from the Colorado Springs Gazette, dated September 1874, described Hartwell's work protecting a gold shipment. Mr. Hartwell's vigilance ensured the safe delivery of our cargo, though regrettably 3 desperate men lost their lives attempting to waylay our expedition. Mr. Hartwell's quick action undoubtedly saved the lives of honest citizens. Elena cross-referenced dates and locations, creating a timeline of Hartwell's activities. The pattern was unmistakable. Wherever Hartwell worked, the death toll among supposed criminals was significantly higher than in other areas. But what made her blood run cold was the realization that the 17 figures carved into his revolver's grip corresponded exactly with 17 documented killings attributed to Hartwell between 1873 and the summer of 1875. Thomas Hartwell wasn't just eliminating threats, he was systematically hunting and killing people, using his reputation as a lawman and protector as cover for murder. Elena's investigation led her to the personal papers of Judge Samuel Morrison, who had presided over legal proceedings in several Kansas counties during the 1870s. Among Morrison's private correspondence, she found letters expressing growing concern about Thomas Hartwell's methods and the suspicious circumstances surrounding many of his killings. In a letter to a colleague dated August 1875, Judge Morrison wrote, "I have growing doubts about Mr. Hartwell's claims of self-defense. The men he kills are consistently found shot in the back or from great distances, suggesting they were unaware of any confrontation. Yet witnesses are never present, and Hartwell's reputation makes questioning his accounts politically difficult. Morrison had apparently begun his own quiet investigation, reviewing coroner reports and witness statements from Hartwell's various encounters. The judge noted inconsistencies in Hartwell's stories and questioned why so many dangerous criminals chose to operate alone when confronting an armed and experienced gunfighter. More disturbing were Morrison's observations about the victims themselves. While Hartwell claimed to be eliminating cattle rustlers and outlaws, many of the dead men had no prior criminal records. Some were simply drifters or unemployed cowboys who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Others were Mexican immigrants, or Native Americans, people whose deaths were less likely to be thoroughly investigated by frontier authorities. Elena found a particularly damning entry in Morrison's private journal. Hartwell seeks out isolated individuals, manufactures justification for violence, and eliminates them with calculated precision. He has turned the chaos of frontier justice into a license for murder, and his reputation as a protector makes him virtually untouchable. Morrison had planned to formally investigate Hartwell and present evidence to federal authorities, but the judge's sudden death from a heart attack in September 1875 had ended his efforts. Elena couldn't help but wonder if Morrison's death had been as natural as it appeared, given his growing threat to Hartwell's operation. Elena discovered that Thomas Hartwell had created the perfect cover for serial murder by positioning himself as a defender of law and order on the frontier. His method was brilliantly simple. He would seek employment protecting cattle drives, gold shipments, or town interests, then use his legitimate authority to hunt down supposed threats to his clients. Records from the Pinkerton Detective Agency, which occasionally employed Hartwell as a contractor, revealed his standard operating procedure. Hartwell would arrive in a new territory and immediately begin gathering information about local criminal activity. He would then approach potential clients' cattle barons, mine owners, or town councils with detailed intelligence about threats to their interests. What made Hartwell particularly effective was his ability to identify genuine criminals and outlaws operating in the area. He would begin by eliminating actual threats, building his reputation for effectiveness, and establishing trust with local authorities. But as Elena's research revealed, Hartwell gradually expanded his definition of threats to include anyone who might serve his murderous purposes. A report from Pinkerton operative James Mitchell, dated June 1875, noted Hartwell's success rate in eliminating criminal elements is unprecedented, but his methods raise questions. He consistently operates alone, refuses backup assistance, and seems to prefer confrontations that result in fatalities rather than arrests. Elena found evidence that Hartwell had developed a sophisticated intelligence network, using bartenders, prostitutes, and other frontier informants to identify potential victims. He particularly targeted individuals who were isolated, without family connections, or whose disappearance wouldn't generate significant investigation. Most chilling was a letter Hartwell had written to a fellow gunfighter, found among court records from an unrelated case. The frontier rewards those bold enough to take what they want. Dead men tell no tales, and live heroes get paid well for their services. Thomas Hartwell had turned the lawless nature of the frontier into his personal hunting ground. Through painstaking research, Elena began to piece together the stories of Thomas Hartwell's victims, the 17 people, represented by the carved figures on his revolver grip. Each carving represented not just a death, but a life cut short by Hartwell's calculated violence. The first victim appeared to be Manuel Reyes, a young Mexican cowboy who had been working cattle drives through Texas in 1873. Reyes had been found shot dead near the Brazos River, allegedly while attempting to steal horses from a remuda under Hartwell's protection. But Elena discovered that Reyes had actually been earning money to bring his family north from Mexico and had no history of criminal activity. Another victim was William "Billy" Harrison, a former Union soldier who had been drifting through Kansas looking for work. Harrison had been killed near Dodge City in early 1874, supposedly while trying to rob a stagecoach. But Harrison's military record showed him to be a decorated veteran with no criminal background, and witnesses had seen him in a saloon miles away from the supposed robbery at the estimated time of the crime. Elena found similar stories for each of the 17 victims' men who had been labeled as criminals or outlaws by Hartwell, but whose actual histories told different stories. Most were simply unfortunate souls who had crossed paths with a predator, who wore a badge and carried the authority of frontier justice. Particularly heartbreaking was the story of Robert Chun, a Chinese immigrant who had been working to establish a small business in Colorado Territory. Chun had been killed in September 1874, allegedly while attempting to rob one of Hartwell's clients. But Chun's personal papers, found among probate records, showed he had been saving money to bring his wife and children from California, and had no reason to risk his future on criminal activity. Each victim had been someone's son, brother, husband, or father, people with hopes, dreams, and plans for the future that had been ended by Thomas Hartwell's need to kill. Elena's research revealed the disturbing truth about when and why the photograph of Thomas Hartwell had been taken. The image had been commissioned by the Abilene Town Council in July 1875 as part of a promotional campaign to attract settlers and businesses to their community. Hartwell was to be featured in a series of photographs showcasing local law enforcement and security personnel. The photograph had been taken by traveling photographer Marcus Webb, who had spent several days in Abilene documenting the town's progress and prosperity. Webb's journal, preserved in the Kansas State Historical Society, contained detailed notes about his subjects, including his impressions of Thomas Hartwell. "Subject appears remarkably calm and confident," Webb had written. "Displays an unusual pride in his equipment, particularly his sidearm, which he insisted be clearly visible in the photograph. Claims to have carved the decorative elements on the grip himself, though when pressed for details about their meaning, became evasive." Webb had noted something else that chilled Elena to the bone. Subject spoke casually about his work eliminating threats to community safety, but something in his manner suggested he takes unusual pleasure in these confrontations. "Most lawmen I have photographed display a certain weariness about violence. This man seems energized by it." The photographer had been disturbed enough by his interaction with Hartwell to include a note with the finished photograph when he delivered it to the town council. Webb had suggested the town might want to reconsider featuring Hartwell so prominently in their promotional materials, though he had been careful not to make specific accusations. Elena realized that the photograph, intended to showcase Abilene's commitment to law and order, had actually documented one of the frontier's most prolific killers at the height of his murderous career. The calm confidence in Hartwell's expression wasn't the look of a dedicated lawman. It was the satisfaction of a predator who believed himself untouchable. Elena's research revealed that Thomas Hartwell's killing spree had come to an abrupt end in late 1875, but not through the actions of law enforcement. Instead, Hartwell had finally chosen the wrong victim, someone whose death would bring consequences he hadn't anticipated. In October 1875, Hartwell had been hired to protect a silver shipment traveling from Colorado Territory to Kansas. Among the crew was James Morrison, the 22-year-old son of Judge Samuel Morrison, the same judge who had been investigating Hartwell's suspicious killings before his death in September. According to the official report, young Morrison had been killed during an attack by bandits attempting to steal the silver shipment. Hartwell claimed that Morrison had died heroically defending the cargo, and that he had driven off the attackers after a fierce gunfight. The story was accepted by local authorities, and Hartwell was praised for his courage in protecting the Thea. Remaining crew and cargo dot, but James Morrison's death finally prompted the federal investigation that Judge Morrison had been unable to complete before his own death. Morrison had shared his suspicions about Hartwell with colleagues in Denver, and when his son died under Hartwell's protection, federal marshals began to take notice. Marshal Robert Taylor, assigned to investigate the incident, quickly discovered inconsistencies in Hartwell's account. The supposed bandit attack had left no physical evidence, no additional bodies, no signs of a sustained gunfight, and no witnesses among the surviving crew members who could confirm Hartwell's version of events. More damning, Morrison's body had been found with a single gunshot wound to the back of the head, fired at close range, hardly consistent with dying in a firefight with distant attackers. Marshal Taylor realized that Hartwell had murdered the young man in cold blood, probably because he had suspected that Morrison might have inherited his father's knowledge about Hartwell's crimes. The federal investigation expanded rapidly, uncovering the pattern of deaths that Elena had discovered in her research. Marshal Taylor's investigation led to a federal warrant for Thomas Hartwell's arrest on charges of murder and conspiracy. But when marshals arrived in Abilene to apprehend him, they discovered that Hartwell had vanished. Someone had warned him that federal authorities were closing in, and he had disappeared into the vast wilderness of the American frontier. What followed was one of the largest manhunts in the history of the U.S. Marshal Service. Hartwell's distinctive appearance and his reputation made him difficult to hide, but his knowledge of frontier survival techniques and his network of contacts kept him ahead of his pursuers for months. The chase finally ended in March 1876, near the border between Colorado Territory and New Mexico. A team of federal marshals and local law enforcement had tracked Hartwell to a remote cabin where he had been hiding with the help of criminal associates. When surrounded and ordered to surrender, Hartwell had chosen to fight rather than face justice. The gunfight lasted nearly 2 hours, with Hartwell using his marksmanship skills to hold off multiple attackers from his fortified position. But unlike his previous victims, the marshals were armed, prepared, and fighting for justice rather than their lives. When Hartwell's ammunition ran out, the marshals closed in and found him dead from multiple gunshot wounds, his infamous revolver still clutched in his hand. Elena's research had revealed that the carved figures on Hartwell's revolver had been preserved as evidence and were now housed in the archives of the U.S. Marshal Service. The weapon served as a grim reminder of how one man had used the chaos and lawlessness of the frontier to mask a campaign of systematic murder. The photograph of Thomas Hartwell, taken in the summer of 1875, remained as the only clear image of one of the American frontier's most prolific killers. His calm, confident expression in the portrait now served as a chilling reminder of how evil could hide behind a badge and how justice, though sometimes delayed, would ultimately prevail. The 17 victims represented by the carvings on his gun finally had their stories told, and their killer's true nature was exposed for history to remember.